Maddox, a short story by Dan Rockwell, word prompt approve. Let's begin. Word prompt approve. Alex 18, subquadrant 12, colony 1. Staring out into the cold space, Frank leaned himself against the airlock door. He watched as colony 1 slowly decompressed, ejecting numerous souls into the bright, each face capturing the frozen expression as they were pulled into the gravity from nearby Alex 18, a proton star headed for collapse itself. The war with Outworlders had taken a turn. Soon there'd be few options left, he thought to himself. Colony 1 suffered in fighting and failed to secure themselves before the mercenaries sealed their fate for them. By my cold bones in the bright, I will not die in the pull of Alex 18 tonight, Frank mumbled as he watched the final 4 compartments of Colony 1 compress into oblivion. You'll know the time to die, a woman's voice said behind him as she kneeled to the floor, cranking a gear and opening a hatch. Frank turned to her and nodded, grabbing a service console from the wall and punched up the screen to enter adjustments. A few million particles shined in the bright as if to form an artful mosaic, while the woman descended into the hatch, down a ladder carrying a set of wires and tubes wrapped around her waist. Frank observed her descent, black hair, athletic figure, a single star tattoo on the back of her neck. Was she a believer? Her voice crackled over the comms as she disappeared from his sight. Which way? Your left, then down a notch. The subcore is there. He began to witness the final compression, air long since departed. The crushing effect not required, no life left as the bright bounced off the section as if to swing at it, pushing it into a lifeless orbit. You know we met once before. Yeah, really, Frank said, resetting his focus on the console panel. She had hard-wired 4 jumpers and 3 relays. With the main harness done, it was just be a matter of core calculations. This was the reason why he was here, why he was assigned to her. As a sentient, he was about as good as you could get for field-driven AI. The downside, of course, was that he was still kinda human. Sentients were first volunteers of the underprivileged, later engineered by the colonists as support engineers and field operative units. Ones that would look like them, think like them, but be overly disposable, unlike them. Frank had a good tour of service under his belt. He considered himself human for the most part, rarely recognizing his AI servitude, nature that is, until the Outworlders began their reach. Taking, destroying, repurposing. He was called to service. His notification, due. It was in the term. You picked up my team in the Maddox. I never seen a ship like that before, she said, clearing the channel with a cuss word. Fuck, that hurt, as sparks ignited in her hands as the final wire connected. The term or terminal gateway was the port of harbor on the 4th moon of Alex, where it all began hundreds of years ago. It was logical to Frank that it would be the first to fall to the Outworlders as well. That was a bad time, Frank said as the woman began her way back to the main hatch. It's when the Bright started as well. Humans assimilated everything they encountered. Seems fitting that after a few millennia in space, they'd rename space itself into something new, yet same. Facts are still sketchy, even for the sentients. But basically, space was renamed Bright because the proton radial signature in this region of space, the constant light waves of its nearby star, Alex 18, soon it would be the source of amplification a new form of science built upon its radial signature. It would be the sentience to first figure out how to harness it, allowing for near-perfect teleportation of bright-enabled ships, of which Frank's ship, the Maddox, would be one, the first. Colonists, however, slowly began to call upon the bright in every part of their lives, almost as if it was a deity of sorts. Now, a few hundred years later, the tribe of bright was common. "Done. Where we at?" the woman said, emerging from the hatch. She was tall and unlike most females he'd been with before. She was nondescript in nature, not revealing too much. Her dark eyes penetrated him with the degree of familiarity he was accustomed to, a kind of calculating mind-to-mind effect. She was all business. "Likewise," Frank replied, finishing the calculation. "You're sure?" she said, as if to hold on to a few more moments of consideration, a moment shared as the mosaic of shattered souls continued to swirl outside. "Yes, we're ready for the next move," he said with a smile. Frank was of medium build himself. He looked human, yet he wasn't, she noted to herself. Catching her gazing pause out the bay window, he turned her in step and said, "You know, in another life, we'd be quite the pair." Her eyes blinked slowly as he attempted the calc. Could he figure her? Unflinched, she brushed past him and proceeded down the corridor to the connection block. "Unlikely," she said, turning the lock door as sweat dropped from her brow, the view of the Maddox connecting tube tunnel in sight. "You've never lived," she said, pulling the heavy door open. Frank stopped in his tracks and chuckled. He was well behind the curve on this one. "You're right. Figure of speech, I forget," he said. "Humanity informing the lack of humanity, that's life." Did he ever live? What was it to be alive? Passage of time? She raced down the connecting tube. Time was of the essence. Right behind her was Frank. Arriving at the Maddox door, she pressed the connect selector and a compression wall raised behind them. Sealed, the Maddox opened its interior doors and allowed entry. Frank nodded as he darted past her and climbed into the command console bridge. "You know this has never been done before," he said, wiring himself into the console. Free-floating light like wires connected to his skull and wrists, showing the metal interior of his mind. "You should have plenty of energy for 2 jumps," she said, taking seat in a secondary console chair well behind him. "You said this was possible," she said, looking up at him as he floated in the space, held by the light. "It's all with assumptions," Frank said as he looked down past his legs into the bright pouring into the front command console view bay. Few could stare directly into Alex 18 like he could. His eyes were synthetic. "Not all data can be calculated with precision. We have to believe," he said as his eyes went from human-like pupils to a constant glow of blue-green as he interfaced with the Maddox. "Jump in 3, 2, 1, jump." The Maddox interior bent in half before her eyes. Her mind couldn't process the optics. The ceiling was the floor. The left wall touched the right wall and back again. Frank floating in front of her, wrapped in position as if to be mere inches away to an infinity. She lost consciousness only to regain it moments later as if she had slept forever. "One more move," Frank said, towering over her. He had scruffy look about himself, she noted, unlike most sentients she'd known. Pressing down with her palms, she realized she was on the floor, knocked out by the jump. "How long was I—" she started to say as he helped her get up. "Out?" he said as she placed her hand on his chest. getting to her feet. They stared at each other for a moment as she felt a whirl of energy hum through him, perhaps the after-effects of a jump. His calc on her was well in progress, and he had next to nothing to comfort him by. Not all data can be calculated with precision. For all you know, our lifetime, he said, pushing her hand aside, parting ways and returning to the connection block. He nodded, seeing the JLO 3, the solar pulse driver, peacefully in view. First jump, successful. Both ships were transported to the staging point. One jump to go. We're in position, Frank said, returning to her side, where she stood dazed, leaning up against the bay window. They were vastly closer to Alex 18, which means they were on the edge end of outworlder territory. She pressed against the transparency, longing it to be closer. No one had seen Alex 18 this close before. As a believer, this was as close as she'd get. Eventually that's gonna go out too, isn't it? She said in a stare outward. Frank stood behind her, his calc stalling as if it was stuck in loops with false assumptions and incorrect data pools. He'd never felt emotion like this. He wasn't wired for it. Yes, and that will be the end of you, Frank replied in a monotone, attempting to sense her heartbeat. Together they gazed. I've wired the secondary console. You can drive everything from there. I assume you're tech level 1 efficient, he said, matching his beat to hers at last. He turned and approached the connection block and nodded. The Maddox interior doors opened as he felt them pass along his fingers. Every ridge, material, screw, stance, wire, support passing through his mind. He stepped into the tube and turned around to face her, now looking back at him. I never did complete the calc, he said with a laugh ending with jump in 3-2. I know, she said, looking back at him with a smile. For your consideration, I approve. ... Jump. Frank lit up as reality distorted in front of him and the same within. He felt more that day than many before it, his lifetime. His jump worked, allowing the Maddox to stay in place and instead beam the JLO 3 to its final destination through a calculation in reverse amplification. With the Maddox gone in view, he turned to a service console on the wall and typed in more commands as he attempted to project the woman next to him in presence, processing as many data points as possible in reflection. Perhaps now was the time for him to meet the bright. The brilliance of Alex 18, ever so present, slowly faded out as the hull of a massive ship began to drift by. The Pandra, the Outworlders' fleet farm ship, was in clear view as he began to smile as if to recognize it and her in his mind. Fleet farms were massive orbital war platforms. They were basically ships to make ships. You lose your war platform, you lose at war. Next up was simple. Overload the pulse driver on JLAW 3, sending it critical. The resulting blast would put a significant dent in the Pandra, but even that wasn't the plan, really. By jumping next to the Pandra, the Outworlders would have quickly realized the potential for damage in any sort and prepare a jump of their own. The real plan was to seize on that possibility and override their fleet protocol, assuming you could get close enough and trick their systems into thinking the JLAW 3 was part of their fleet. It went better than expected. They would be jumping soon, and he had mere moments for the final move, changing the jump coordinates of their own fleet. Destination, Alex 18. Their fleet would disintegrate in the brilliance of a millisecond, as if to stand in the presence of God itself, or so the believers would think. It was hard to process what he was feeling as he hacked across the bright into the Outworlder's fleet systems. Success. He felt a jump coming on. Sentients can't take their own lives, yet he was full of calm. His final command transmitted. She approved. Jump.